Did you ever wonder why the person who seems least interested in commitment becomes utterly consumed by thoughts of someone who suddenly becomes unavailable? The secret trigger that makes an avoidant think about you constantly isn't what most people expect. It's not grand gestures or endless declarations of love. It's something far more subtle and psychologically powerful. Picture this scenario. Someone who typically runs from emotional intimacy finds themselves checking their phone obsessively, wondering what someone is doing, who they're with, and why they haven't heard from them. This isn't fiction. It's the fascinating intersection of human psychology and attachment behavior, where scarcity becomes the most potent force in reshaping someone's entire mental landscape. The human mind operates on predictable patterns, even when dealing with something as complex as avoidant attachment. Those who struggle with intimacy have spent years perfecting the art of emotional distance, creating elaborate mental frameworks that justify their independence and minimize their need for others. Yet there exists one psychological phenomenon so powerful it can completely override these carefully constructed defenses. This phenomenon isn't manipulation or game playing. It's rooted in fundamental cognitive biases that affect every human being, regardless of their attachment style. The scarcity effect and availability heuristic work together to create a perfect storm of psychological intrigue that can transform even the most emotionally distant person into someone who experiences genuine longing and preoccupation. Understanding this isn't about learning tricks to ensnare someone's attention. It's about comprehending the deeper psychological mechanics that govern human attraction and attachment. When someone with avoidant tendencies encounters true scarcity, not manufactured unavailability but genuine limitation of access, their brain begins processing this information in ways that contradict their usual patterns. The availability heuristic plays a crucial role here. This cognitive bias causes people to overestimate the importance of information that comes to mind easily. For avoidants, who are accustomed to having people readily available or easily dismissible, encountering someone who isn't constantly accessible creates a mental disruption. Their brain starts working overtime to fill in the gaps, to understand what this person is doing and why they're not immediately available. This psychological shift doesn't happen overnight, and it's not guaranteed to work with every avoidant individual. However, when the conditions align properly, the results can be remarkably profound. The person who once took relationships for granted suddenly finds themselves in unfamiliar territory, experiencing emotions and thoughts they've successfully avoided for years. What makes this particularly fascinating is how it challenges the avoidant's core beliefs about relationships and human nature. They've built their identity around not needing others, around being self-sufficient and emotionally independent. When scarcity forces them to confront the possibility of genuine loss, their psychological defenses begin to crack in unexpected ways. The key insight here isn't just about understanding avoidant behavior, it's about recognizing how scarcity affects human psychology universally. Whether someone is securely attached, anxiously attached, or avoidant, the principle remains consistent. We value most what we perceive as limited or difficult to obtain. Consider the story of Marcus, a successful architect who had mastered the art of keeping people at arm's length. At 34, he had perfected a routine of casual relationships that never progressed beyond surface-level connection. His friends often joked that he treated dating like a revolving door, always someone new coming in as someone else quietly exited. Marcus's pattern was predictable: initial charm and attention, followed by gradual withdrawal whenever emotions deepened. He had an uncanny ability to sense when someone was becoming too attached, and he'd instinctively create distance. This wasn't cruelty, it was self-preservation disguised as independence. Then he met someone at a conference in Chicago. She was intelligent, engaging, and seemed genuinely unimpressed by his usual repertoire of charm. Unlike others who pursued him with increasing intensity, she maintained her own busy life and interests. She was friendly during their conversations, but never reached out between their occasional encounters at professional events. At first, Marcus felt relieved. Finally, someone who understood boundaries and didn't demand constant attention. But as weeks passed without contact, something unexpected began happening. He found himself wondering what she was working on, whether she'd enjoyed their last conversation, and why she hadn't mentioned their interaction on social media like others typically did. The months that followed became a masterclass in psychological tension. Every few weeks they'd encounter each other at industry events. Their conversations were always pleasant, intellectually stimulating, but she never suggested meeting outside these professional contexts. She seemed genuinely content with this limited interaction, never pushing for more or expressing disappointment when their paths didn't cross. Marcus's mind began working in ways that surprised him. He started planning his conference attendance around events where she might appear. He found himself paying attention to her LinkedIn updates and professional achievements. Most unsettling of all, he began questioning why someone so interesting seemed so unaffected by their connection. The turning point came when he learned she'd been offered a position in London. Suddenly, the comfortable assumption that she'd always be occasionally available at industry events evaporated. The casual encounters that had become a pleasant fixture in his professional life were about to end permanently. For the first time in years, Marcus experienced something he'd successfully avoided: the fear of genuine loss. What happened next defied everything he thought he knew about himself. Instead of feeling relief at avoiding another potential complication, he felt an unexpected urgency. The possibility of never seeing her again created a psychological pressure he hadn't experienced since childhood. This wasn't about romance or even attraction in the traditional sense. It was about confronting scarcity in its purest form. Marcus realized that her consistent unavailability had created space for his imagination to fill in gaps. Because their interactions were limited and she maintained her own independent life, his mind had constructed elaborate scenarios about who she was and what she might be thinking. The availability heuristic had worked its magic. Because he couldn't easily access information about her daily life, thoughts, and feelings, the limited information he did have became magnified in importance. The story concluded with Marcus doing something completely out of character. He reached out directly, not with his usual casual confidence, but with genuine vulnerability. He acknowledged that their professional interactions had meant more to him than he'd initially realized, and he wondered if she'd be interested in continuing their connection despite the geographical distance. Understanding how to create healthy scarcity requires walking a delicate line between unavailability and disinterest. The goal isn't to play games or manipulate someone's emotions. Instead, it's about maintaining your own life, interests, and priorities in ways that naturally create limitation and mystery. The first principle involves living authentically busy and fulfilled life. This isn't about pretending to be unavailable or manufacturing fake conflicts. When someone genuinely has work projects, friendships, hobbies, and personal goals that occupy their time and energy, natural scarcity occurs. The avoidant person encounters someone who isn't constantly accessible, not because they're playing hard to get, but because they genuinely have other priorities. This authentic unavailability triggers the scarcity effect in powerful ways. The avoidance mind, accustomed to people who make them their primary focus, suddenly encounters someone who treats them as one important element among many in their life. This shift in dynamic creates psychological tension that the avoidance brain works to resolve. The second principle involves mastering the art of consistent inconsistency in communication patterns. This doesn't mean being unreliable or disrespectful. Rather, it means avoiding the predictable patterns that allow avoidants to categorize and dismiss relationships. Instead of responding immediately to every message or always being available when they reach out, maintain natural variations in responsiveness based on genuine life circumstances. When someone is working on an important project, traveling for business, or spending time with family, they naturally become less immediately accessible. These organic interruptions in availability create cognitive tension for the avoidant person. They become accustomed to hearing from someone regularly, then suddenly find themselves wondering about the silence. The availability heuristic amplifies this effect. Because the avoidant can't immediately access information about what's happening in the other person's life, their mind begins filling in details. This mental activity, trying to understand and predict another person's behavior, is exactly what avoidants typically avoid. Yet scarcity makes this cognitive work inevitable. The third principle focuses on maintaining emotional equilibrium regardless of the avoidant's behavior patterns. Avoidants often test boundaries by withdrawing or creating drama to see how others respond. The natural scarcity approach involves remaining consistent in your own emotional state and not chasing or pursuing when they create distance. This consistency creates a paradox for the avoidant mind. They expect their withdrawal tactics to generate pursuit, anxiety, or emotional reactivity. When someone remains stable and continues living their life regardless of the avoidant's behavior, it creates cognitive dissonance. The avoidant begins questioning their usual assumptions about how relationships work and how much power they have over others' emotions. The fourth principle involves strategic sharing of personal information and experiences. Rather than being completely open about every aspect of daily life, thoughts, and feelings, maintain natural boundaries around personal disclosure. This isn't about being secretive or deceptive. It's about respecting the natural pace of relationship development and not overwhelming someone with information. Avoidants are particularly sensitive to feeling overwhelmed by emotional information. When someone shares appropriate amounts of personal content while maintaining reasonable boundaries, it creates intrigue rather than suffocation. The avoidant's curiosity becomes engaged because they're receiving enough information to stay interested, but not so much that they feel overwhelmed or pressured. The psychological reasoning behind each of these approaches centers on disrupting the avoidant's predictable relationship patterns. Avoidants have typically experienced relationships where people become increasingly available, accommodating, and focused on the relationship's development. This pattern allows them to maintain control and emotional distance. Healthy scarcity disrupts these patterns by presenting the avoidant with someone who remains independently valuable regardless of the relationship's status. This independence isn't threatening or rejecting, it's simply authentic. The person maintains their own life, interests, and emotional stability, whether the avoidant is present or distant. This approach works because it addresses the core fears that drive avoidant behavior without triggering their defensive mechanisms. Avoidants fear engulfment and loss of independence, but they're paradoxically drawn to people who demonstrate genuine self-sufficiency. Scarcity signals that spending time together is a choice rather than a need, which makes the interaction feel safer for the avoidant while simultaneously making it more precious. The effectiveness of this approach lies in its authenticity. Rather than trying to become someone different or playing psychological games, it involves becoming the most genuine version of yourself, someone with interests, goals, and a life that exists independently of any romantic relationship. This authenticity creates natural scarcity that feels organic rather than manipulative. Remember that the goal isn't to trap or ensnare an avoidant partner. The objective is to create the conditions where genuine connection becomes possible by removing the psychological pressures that typically cause avoidance to withdraw. When someone feels free to choose presence or absence without consequences, they're more likely to choose presence genuinely. The secret trigger that makes an avoidant think about someone constantly isn't actually secret at all. It's one of the most fundamental aspects of human psychology. We value what we perceive as rare, limited, or difficult to obtain. This principle affects everyone, but it has particularly profound effects on people who have spent years avoiding genuine emotional connection. Understanding this dynamic transforms how relationships can develop with avoidant individuals. Instead of pursuing harder when they withdraw, instead of trying to prove worthiness through increased availability, the path forward involves embodying the very independence that avoidants claim to value. This isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming genuinely self-sufficient and emotionally stable. The scarcity effect and availability heuristic work together to create psychological conditions where even the most emotionally guarded person begins experiencing genuine curiosity and longing. When someone isn't constantly available, when their life doesn't revolve around the relationship, when they maintain their own interests and priorities, they become psychologically valuable in ways that abundant availability never achieves. This approach requires patience and genuine personal development. Building an authentic life filled with meaningful work, relationships, and interests takes time and effort. However, the investment pays dividends not just in romantic relationships, but in every area of life. People are naturally drawn to those who embody genuine fulfillment and independence. The most important insight from understanding these psychological principles is that healthy relationships require two whole individuals choosing each other, not two halves seeking completion. Avoidants are particularly sensitive to feeling needed or depended upon, but they can be deeply attracted to people who want their presence without needing it. Moving forward, focus on building the kind of life that would be fulfilling whether any particular person is part of it or not. Develop interests that genuinely excite and challenge personal growth. Cultivate friendships that provide emotional support and intellectual stimulation. Pursue professional goals that create genuine satisfaction and accomplishment. When life becomes genuinely full and meaningful, independent of romantic relationships, natural scarcity emerges. There isn't enough time for everyone who might want attention. Energy gets allocated to the most valuable and rewarding connections. This selectivity creates the psychological conditions where even avoidant individuals begin recognizing and appreciating genuine value. The journey isn't about changing someone else or forcing connection where it doesn't naturally exist. It's about becoming the kind of person who naturally creates healthy psychological tension through authentic unavailability. When someone lives this way consistently, they often discover that avoidant individuals begin pursuing connection with the same intensity they once used to avoid it. The hunter becomes the hunted, not through manipulation, but through the simple power of psychological scarcity combined with genuine personal fulfillment.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.